Again, thank you all for being with us this evening. My name is Yolanda Jones. I am Senior Project Manager for Community Outreach for Planning. You have joined us for our Thursdays with the UDO virtual listening session, and I am joined by other members of our staff, including some of the UDO team members. This session is on parking. So the virtual listening sessions that we've held over the past several weeks were selected based on public comments and feedback we have received to date, and some of the topics that kind of have risen to the top. These sessions have been a chance and remain a chance this evening for you as the community to voice your opinion about the standards within the first draft of the UDO. And they're really designed as an additional avenue for you to submit comments on the first draft. The goal of this session is for staff to listen to your feedback, your suggestions, and your concerns. And we'd like to stop and please note that the emphasis during these sessions is really on listening versus responding. Questions and comments that you post during these sessions will be transcribed and entered into our comment portal for response at a later date. And we do that after the close of each session. So quickly, I'd like to go over a few guidelines for this evening's meeting. Those of you who signed up to speak during registration will be called upon in the order for which you registered. Each speaker will have the floor for 2 minutes, and please note that you will receive a request from the meeting host to unmute yourself when it is your turn to speak. To maintain fairness, once your 2 minutes has expired, you will be muted so that we can move on to the next person. Those of you who did not sign up during meeting registration but wish to speak, you may enter your name into our chat and you will be added to a queue. We will call from that queue, time permitting, and we will definitely have time during this session. Once the queue is cleared, attendees may request to speak again. If I have to cut you off because you're at your 2 minutes, just for fairness, we will come back around to allow you to finish your thought if we do have time permitting, and we should in this session. We encourage attendees to share your opinions in an honest and civil manner. And again, our emphasis tonight is going to be on listening versus responding. Here you'll see a few key dates surrounding the UDO. The first draft was released on October the 7th, and we are currently in the first phase of engagement. Public comments for this phase end on March 18th, which is rapidly approaching. That will be next Friday. So a week from tomorrow will be the closing of our public comments for this phase. So we definitely suggest that you get those in. If you want to express them here tonight, that's great. However, if you'd like to go to our website and do that as well, you are open to do so. After the public comment period ends, we will review those comments to be included in a red line draft of the UDO, of the second draft of the UDO, and that is scheduled for May. The City Council will have a public hearing in June of this year, as well as a Planning Committee recommendation with a hopeful adoption of the UDO in July. So just to look ahead to what you can expect for this evening, tonight's session will include proposed 3-tier vehicle parking requirements, electrical vehicle parking requirements, required bicycle parking, and these will all be presented by Alan Goodwin, Deputy Project Manager for the UDO. We will then open the floor for community comments in our open forum, and I'll go back over those rules, guidelines before we open the floor for the forum. And then we're going to close by highlighting some UDO resources that can help you as you navigate the draft of the UDO, and where you can actually find the previous listening and virtual conversations to be able to be informed. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Alan.
Thank you, Yolanda. The off-street vehicle and bicycle parking requirements in the UDO are in Article 19 in the table of contents. And you can see, if you can read the fine print, that under Article 19, there are 11 different areas of regulations in the parking article. We're not going to cover all of them, time doesn't allow, but we're going to go over the basics of vehicle parking requirements, electric vehicle parking requirements, which is something new for us, as well as bicycle parking. Before we do, though, our vehicle parking requirements are based on a 3-tier system, which refers to the new zoning districts in the UDO. So this is just a very quick overview of our new UDO zoning districts. They're generally divided into three categories: the neighborhood zoning districts, which can be thought of as our residential, primarily residential areas. And these are our neighborhood 1 and neighborhood 2 districts. And then our employment districts, where people generally go to work, our commercial districts, campus districts, manufacturing and logistics, which are like industrial districts, as well as a new innovation mixed use district. And then our centers zoning districts, which are areas of the community that are higher in density, that are meant to be a community center with a variety of goods and services, as well as residential available. And so you can see the various types of centers and center zoning districts, as well as our transit-oriented development districts. And these districts have been developed to correspond with the place types that are currently being mapped by another team in our policy mapping process. And they come to us through the adopted Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. So I mentioned the three-tier approach to parking requirements, where tier 1 is the most auto-oriented, and it includes zoning districts such as the manufacturing and logistics and the campus and most of our neighborhood districts, where we're proposing to have a minimum off-street parking requirement, very similar to what we have in our current zoning ordinance, but no parking maximums. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. Our tier 2, our middle tier, has zoning districts which would have both a minimum parking requirement as well as a maximum. And our tier 3, our most urban of zoning districts, would have no parking minimums at all. And in most cases, they would have a maximum parking limit. And there are a couple of exceptions to that, and I'll go into that in a couple of slides. So we'll go through each of these three tiers in a little bit more detail. Tier 1, the one with the minimum off-street parking requirements and no maximum, would apply, as I said, to our districts that are more auto intense, may not have the pedestrian network or transit network that some of the other districts are. So these would be the type of places in zoning districts where people would be more apt to rely on getting to and from places by car, and would need to have a certain amount of parking available to them. So the typical minimum parking standards, and I say typical because they do vary according to the specific use, but typical for a single family home, for example, would be 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. Other residential, such as an apartment or a townhome, the minimum parking would be typically 1.5 spaces. And for non-residential uses, typically it would require 1 parking space per 500 square feet of floor area. But obviously there are exceptions, and according to the use, there could be different parking standards based on unique characteristics. For example, a car wash is not a use that you would expect you would need a lot of parking spaces for, other than the employees who work there. People are just coming in and driving through and leaving. Correctional facilities are another example where the people who work there would need a place to park, but everybody else in that building is probably not going to need a car and a parking space. Our tier 2 is the tier which has both minimum parking requirements as well as maximum. The maximum wouldn't apply to parking lots and parking structures, but would apply to other types of development. And examples and typical requirements for this tier would be, as a minimum for residential, 1 parking space per dwelling unit. The maximum would be 2 per dwelling unit. And non-residential, again, typical, but with some exceptions, the minimum would be 1 space per 750 square feet of floor area. And the typical maximum would be 1 space per 250. Tier 3, that most urban of tiers with urban districts, places that are generally have a good pedestrian and bicycle network and are well served by public transit, areas where people may not rely as heavily on their own personal cars and therefore the demand for parking may be less, would for the most part not have any minimum parking requirements, but instead would have maximum requirements. There is an exception to that that applies to certain uses like multifamily, live performance venues or nightclubs, restaurants and bars, that kind of thing. If they're within 200 feet of a neighborhood 1 zoning district, which is generally a low density residential area, they would also have a minimum parking requirement. But other than that, even for those uses, as long as they're not within 200 feet of a neighborhood 1 zoning district, even those uses would not have a minimum parking requirement. And then the maximums typically for a residential use would be anywhere from 1 to 2 spaces per dwelling unit, depending on the type of dwelling. And for non-residential, the maximum would typically range from 1 space per 200 square feet to 1 space per 300 square feet. When calculating the parking requirement for a development or a use, it's based on the use. So we do have a parking table that goes according to use, and it will tell you by use and by district the number of parking spaces required for each. Excuse me. And for a mixed use, the number of parking spaces is the sum of all of the uses in the development. Minimum parking, if there is a minimum parking requirement, would be triggered either by new construction of a principal building or if an existing principal building is expanded and the expansion would result in a requirement of more than 10 additional spaces, or if the change of use, if there's a change of use that would require more than 10 additional spaces. If any of those 3 events occur, then the minimum off-street parking would need to be provided. There are some parking spaces that would be exempt from parking maximums, and these would include required handicapped parking, electric vehicle parking spaces, any pickup or drop-off spaces for things like ride-hailing or delivery vehicles, and any on-street parking that abuts the space. And there's also an allowance for visitor spaces for townhomes and multifamily who would be able to exceed whatever the parking maximum may be for those. So I mentioned electric vehicle parking and charging stations, and this is a new concept for us in Charlotte, but it's one that we think is important to meet what we think will be an increased demand for EV charging in the future. For the purposes of this, we are talking about 3 different types of electric vehicle charging levels, if you will: EV capable, EV ready, and EV SE installed. EV capable, which is kind of the lowest tier of EV charging, simply means providing enough capacity in the electrical panel for future EV parking demand and providing a continuous raceway from that electrical panel out to the location of the future EV parking spaces. EV ready is all of that. In addition, there is a conduit that terminates in either a junction box or a 240 volt outlet at those parking spaces. And then finally, EV SE installed is the kind of the gold standard of EV charging. And that's what you're seeing in the picture there. It's the actual installation of a level 2 electric vehicle charging station. So electric vehicle charging requirements don't apply as currently drafted in the UDO to all uses. They would only apply to multifamily stacked dwellings, in other words, apartments or multifamily high-rise, if you will. The residential component of a mixed-use development, so mixed use with residential with apartments, hotels, or parking lots and parking structures as a principal use. And we started out, because this is new, we wanted to kind of ease into these requirements. And these are the uses that we felt would generate the most demand for overnight EV charging. So people who live in an apartment that have an electric vehicle, they would have a place to charge their car overnight. People traveling who are staying in hotels and they arrive by car in electric vehicles, they would be provided with a place to charge overnight, as well as any parking lot or parking structure. EVSE installed at highest level of EV charging, those spaces don't count toward parking maximums, but if there's a parking minimum, they would count for 2 parking spaces. I'm going to go back because I kind of skipped over that table at the top, and that is important, and I wanted to talk about that. Electric vehicle charging requirements would not apply to any parking that was provided in between 0 and 9. So if a development or a project or use provides fewer than 10 parking spaces, there is currently no EV parking contemplated to be required. If the number of parking spaces provided is between 10 and 25, then 20% of those spaces would need to be EV capable, and another 10% would need to be EV ready. There would be no requirement for an actual EVSE installed. Any parking provided between 26 and 50 spaces, again, 20% EV capable, 10% EV ready, but at least one actual EVSE charging station. And then if more than 50 parking spaces were provided, again, the 20% EV capable plus 10% EV ready spaces. And in addition, 2% of the total number of parking spaces would need to be actual EVSE charging stations. So finally, let's move to bicycle parking. There is a requirement for bicycle parking whenever a new building is constructed or an existing building is expanded that would result in a requirement for more than 5 additional bike spaces, or again, a change of use where the new use would result in a requirement for more than 5 additional bike spaces. We can think of bicycle parking in terms of both short-term spaces and long-term spaces. And we'll look at a table in the sample table on the next slide. But generally speaking, the number of long-term spaces is expressed as a percentage of the total number of bike parking spaces required. There are some exceptions. So if bike parking is required, there has to be at least 2 short-term bike spaces provided. If a project is so large that it may require a lot of bike parking, we are going to cap that at 30 short-term bike parking spaces and no more than 50 long-term bike parking spaces. So there conceivably could be projects that are so large that the required bike parking is just a very large number. And so we're capping it, proposing to cap it at no more than 30 short-term need to be provided and no more than 50 long-term. So here's a sample of the bike parking requirements you'll find in the UDO. So in the left-hand column, there are the various uses. The uses are the same as our use matrix, which is in Article 15, I believe, of the UDO, which lists all our uses and which districts they're permitted in. So our bike parking table mirrors that so that it's fairly easy to follow. So you would look at the use and then look over and find the required number of bicycle parking spaces, often expressed as a 1 per X number of square feet number, and others it's expressed in different ways. And then in that last column, that is the percentage of those spaces that have to be long-term spaces. And those are typically, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So there are some uses that don't require any bicycle parking, things like single-family houses and duplexes and triplexes. They don't have a minimum bike parking requirement, the thought being that people living in those types of dwellings will have their own arrangements for where to keep their bikes, whether it's in the garage or in a house. somewhere. And then other uses that are typically auto-oriented may not have a bike parking requirement, things like a car wash or a gas station, or industrial uses like a salvage yard or recycling center, where you would not expect people to arrive by bicycle. Finally, just the types of bike parking. Short-term parking is typically what we think of as a bike rack. There are some approved designs that can be used in Charlotte. They're in our land development standards manual, but you can deviate from those standard designs if you've got something creative like the photo on the right, but they have to be approved in advance before they can be used as required bike parking. And then the short-term parking may be located in the right-of-way if CDOT or NCDOT approves. And then long-term bike parking is typically the parking for people who either live in a location where they arrive by bike or keep their bike, or they work there. So the bike is there for a long period of time, longer period of time. It needs to be fully covered and out of the weather. So that could either be in a bicycle locker, like in the middle photo there, which you may see around town, or it could be indoors. It could be in a parking garage or something like that, just as long as it's out of the weather. And so if you need to keep your bike parked all day and it starts to rain, your bike's not outside on the bike rack getting all wet. So that concludes the brief overview of the parking requirements for this evening. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Yolanda.
Thank you, Alan. So let me go ahead and go back over the guidelines really quickly, and we will open up our forum. So each speaker will have 2 minutes. You will be called in the order for which you've registered to speak prior to the meeting. Please note that you will receive a request from the meeting host to unmute yourself when it is your turn to speak. To maintain fairness, once your 2 minutes has expired, you will be muted so that we can call upon the next person. Those of you who did not sign up to speak during registration but wish to speak, just drop your name in the chat and we will add you to our queue. And we definitely will have time to be able to call you up out of the queue. Once that queue is cleared, we will allow the speakers who previously spoke. If you did not get to complete your thought, I'll do my best to call you back up in order for you to complete your thought. Please note that this is just an additional way to add comments for the UDO. If you would like to add your comments written, you may just visit our website, charlotteudo.org. And additionally, we just want to stop to point out that what we take from you here in this forum will actually be entered into our comment portal. But if it's a point of clarification, we will be sure to respond to that. That is done periodically on the website, those responses. However, if you are asking for an actual update or change within the UDO, we don't want to give the unrealistic expectation that those will be responded to. That will be what we will consider during the period between the first draft and the second draft to be included in the red line draft of the UDO. And again, that is scheduled to come out in May. So we'll go ahead and start our forum. The first speaker that I have for this evening is Martin Zimmerman. Martin Zimmerman. Martin, are you here with us? Michael Groover. Michael Groover. Okay. Diane St. John. Diane St. John. Okay. Josh Benner. Josh Benner, are you with us this evening?
Hi.
Hi. You have your 2 minutes. You can go ahead and start. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to propose that the parking minimums should all be converted to parking maximums with the same amount for tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. I'd also like to suggest that bike parking spots count towards those parking maximums or minimums. We should let the prerogative of the developer or the homeowner decide if they provide bike parking or vehicular parking. And I think for now, I'll cede the floor.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Okay. And that is actually the last registered speaker that we have. If there's anyone else who would like to speak, again, please go ahead and just drop your name in the chat and we can send you the request to speak. And again, we will transcribe your comments to put them into our comment portal. I know not everyone wants to be a public speaker, so I totally get it. If you'd like to just drop your comments in the chat, that is another way in which you can provide your comments to us, as well as, like I said, visiting us at charlotteudo.org and placing your comments into the portal. I'm just going to reiterate, and I'll do that again in another slide. March 18th is the very last day to do that. Give it just another moment because we want to give everyone the ability to speak. And I'm going to do my due diligence and go back through the list one more time. Martin Zimmerman, Michael Groover, Diane St. John, no additional speakers. Okay, Alan, we will move forward with our presentation. So as you see on your screen here, this is actually how you will comment if you choose to do so at our website, charlotteudo.org. We definitely need your feedback. It is vital to this process that we have the feedback of the community. In order to submit your comments, you'll need to, you'll need to submit those by March 18th. Again, Friday, March 18th is the last day to be able to submit. Comments should be submitted by topic. However, if you would like to make a general comment, we do welcome those, but our preference is for them to be submitted by topic in order to assist in responding and getting the right staff members to respond to those comments. A video tutorial is available on our website in order to help you along. If you get stuck and you don't really know how to comment or you're trying to figure it out, there is a video tutorial on our website that kind of walks you completely through the process and how you can actually comment. Slide. Oh, perfect. Thank you. So this slide is just going to show you, as I said previously, when we started this meeting over the past several weeks, we have discussed multiple topics. These topics arose from comments and feedback that we had received to date. So if you would like to, you can go back and watch those listening sessions. They can be found on our website as well, charlotteudo.org. In addition to the listening sessions, which again, I'm just going to reiterate, we're open or available for listening. We were here just to hear feedback from the community and not necessarily respond. We do have virtual conversations that happened previously in this engagement that you can actually go back and watch the videos or the presentations on specific topics. We did a number of those and they are available as well. When you go to the website for the recordings, you're going to be able to see the actual recording itself. The slides that were presented are available for download and PDF downloadable. The chat transcripts from those conversations are all listed on our website. So if you'd like to go back, each of those happened from 12 to 1 and 6 to 7, just as we've conducted this listening session today. So you can go back, and if you'd like to watch all of them, please be our guest. We definitely encourage you to go back and view those, and maybe some of the questions you may have could be answered through watching those videos as well. Just check my chat. Oh, thank you, Mariah. She's dropped in a couple of links that would be helpful for those of you who would like to submit your comments and watch the video tutorial. And that is the end of our presentation. We just want to say thank you very much for giving us the time this evening, and we wish you to have a good evening.